am I living the life that I want to live?
If you don't give yourselves those mental breaks, you end up in that same state of burnout.
And you realize, wait a minute, I need to start living my life.
So I'm so happy, though, that it happened in retrospect because it's taken me on this human path.
All right, friends, today we have a friend of mine, John Miles, who wrote the book Passion Struck. As an author, I have found a new appreciation for authors, and this guy hits the mark on every level. John, thanks for joining us today.
Jen, thank you so much for that amazing compliment. And it's such an honor to be here with you. And I loved it when you were on my show. And congratulations to you on your new book as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so getting into your personal story, right? Like, let's start there. You were a Fortune 500 executive, you were a decorated naval officer, yet you were bored and lonely and unfulfilled, which from the outside doesn't make sense, but I think a lot of us can relate.
One of my favorite quotes that I think talks to this is by Henry David Thoreau. And he says, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And I think this quiet desperation is even more pronounced in this fast paced, success driven society we find ourselves in. And you ask the question, why do so many people fall into this trap? The simple fact, and why I started the whole passion struck movement that I'm doing, is that I think more and more of us are struggling to find the joy and meaning in our lives. And if we want a different life, we've got to start making different choices starting right now.
What was that choice for you? Like, how did that start, like the evolution?
Yeah, there's a great book that came out in August of 2003 by Tim Kasser. It's called The High Price of Materialism. And he offers one of the best scientific explanations that I found on how our contemporary culture of consumerism and materialism affects our everyday happiness and our psychological health. And what ends up happening, I think, is that we oftentimes find ourselves in this position of going down this path that we might have crafted, might not have, but we end up in a position where we have the burden of responsibilities that accumulate. It's the rent and car payments, our family needs, and these financial commitments start making it feel impossible to step away from this stable yet unfulfilling job. And the need to provide this lifestyle becomes a chain that limits your freedom, your ability to take risks, and choice. And that's exactly how I found myself in. I was at a point where people who are listening to this are going to call me crazy, but I was a C-level in a Fortune 50 company making well over seven figures a year. And yet inside, I was absolutely miserable because my life had become a series of everyday meetings that the majority of the time were focused on the incredible politics that were happening between the senior executive team or the HR issues of having thousands of people across five different continents. And what I found was that the things that I was most passionate about, which were creativity, innovation, being able to form strong connections, I was getting further removed from doing those on a regular basis. And so I just kept feeling less and less meaning to waking up every day in the job I was doing.
And what was the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, Jen, I'm going to get like philosophical with you here.
Okay.
I think that we hear a couple inner voices, and I'm not talking the psychological, schizophrenic type of voices. I'm talking the inner voices that, if we're really mindful and we let ourselves hear, they're there. One tends to govern everything that we do, and it's this voice that puts us in this repetitive motion of doing the same things over and over because we're comfortable where we're at and we don't want to change. And then we have this other voice that is even harder to hear, and you really have to search for it, but it's really calling you towards what your ideal life is and what your ideal life could become. But oftentimes we don't listen to it because we don't hear it because of all the noise that's around our lives, and we don't take the time for that introspection. And that's what was happening to me. Is I found myself No, a lot of people call it the autopilot life. I don't like that analogy because I think even when you're on autopilot, you're still going in a direction. I think the better analogy is we're like a pinball and we are just unintentional about our day and we're bouncing off the things that we hit. And what ended up happening for me is this: I started to hear this second inner voice, but it was telling me to do something that was so 180 degrees from what I was doing. It was telling me to go out and help the people who feel hopeless, helpless, battered, bored, broken, and beaten in the world. And I'm sitting here as the CIO of this company thinking, what in the hell am I supposed to do with that? How do you make a living doing that? What does that exactly mean? And so I would say, people who tell you they find their purpose overnight, I laugh because to me, it's like this journey that takes all this time. And that time is when you really allow yourself to be with yourself and let these things in and process and figure out their meaning. And I have to say it happened immediately, but it actually, the big event for me happened probably 6 or 7 years down this path of self exploration. And I'm like you, I love to work out and I go to the gym every day. At this point in my life, I was going to Orange Theory all the time and
Yep.
CrossFit. And I took my daughter to school. It was just like any normal day going to the gym. And we had an electrical fire. And because of that, I went home earlier than I typically would have. And it just turns out that there were there was a person who had been watching my whereabouts and had timed their entry into my house on this particular day to be when I was supposed to be working out. And so I end up walking into the house and stumbling upon a burglar in my house who unfortunately had canvassed the house before. And I ended up walking up the stairs and come face to face with him holding a gun, my gun, pointed at me. And luckily, I was able to evade and get out of the situation. But really, that event, and then 4 days later, my best friend committed suicide. And those two things just brought forth this deep and utter conviction of what the heck am I doing with my life? Why am I spending so much time making other people's dreams come true, but I'm not making my own dreams come true? And it was finally the last straw, and it really propelled me at that point that I have to do what this calling is, and that eventually led to Passion Struck.
Isn't it crazy? Like these things that could have taken our lives, but wake us up to living and realize like this game ends at some point. And if it ended today, am I doing the things that I want to be doing? Am I living the life that I want to live? And when you realize we don't get forever here, it's a lot easier to start leaning into other things that get us more excited because if it was done, we left a lot on the table.
Yeah, and I know this is something that you and I unfortunately
Share.
both share in common is this
Yeah.
near death experience. And I had had them previously when I was in the military, but I think when I started looking at how my kids were viewing me, how I wanted them to remember me, the legacy that I wanted to leave, and the fact that I wasn't serving others in the way that I felt called to do, it just was time for a profound shift. So I'm so happy though that it happened in retrospect because it's taken me on this whole new path.
Okay, so you had this, near death experience. Your friend commits suicide, and you realize, wait a minute, I need to start living my life. How did you start shifting the pieces to get you to where you are today?
Well, it's a great setup for the book because honestly, I use the principles that I write about in the book. But I think what I first did and what I encourage people not to do is I tried to do too much at one time. And that I found is never going to work for anyone. But what I originally started with is if I want to create this new life, I need to life craft a vision of that future self I want to become. And that was really the starting point, was really starting to look at we have our actual self we have our ideal self and we have our ought self. So your actual self is who you are. Your ideal self is who you want to become. And your ought self is sometimes who you think you should become because it's the one that has the obligations and kind of the chains. And so for me, it was really figuring out how do I position myself more towards the ideal self that I wanted so that I would life craft that future version of myself. And then what were some of the steps that I needed to take to get there? And so for me, it really started with I needed to get to a deeper mindfulness practice and deeper exploration of myself. And so that was the first starting point was how do I start really practicing mindfulness again? How do I get into that practice of yoga? How do I intentionally put myself there so that I can pave this manifestation of who I want to be someday? So that would have been the first step.
Okay, so yoga as part of your mindfulness practice, do you have other things that are part of that as well?
Yeah, the most simple one when people ask me is I think for different people, getting into mindfulness is a personal journey. I'm
Mhm.
not that type who can just sit on the ground with my legs crossed and be able to do it. It just doesn't work as well for me. So what I do, the easiest path for me is first thing in the morning. So I get up very early. I wake up at 5 a.m. and I love that time of day because you go out and there's just complete stillness. All you hear is nature around you. There's no cars, no other people, really not a lot of distractions. And so I start my walk with my dog in the first 15 to 20 minutes. It's completely me trying to allow nature to come in. And that then, the more I concentrate on the things that I'm hearing, experiencing, it allows me to then start exploring my thoughts. And I started out every single day with a gratitude practice. And then I think about the intentions that I want to set for the day. And then I start exploring my past day and what worked, what didn't, what do I want to do differently, and uh, that starts the practice for me. And then from there, some days I might do yoga or spin class or something else. But then being able to exercise and get that anxiety out is a nice twofer for me because I get the mindfulness practice and then I get that anxiety release as well.
Yeah. No, I find that movement allows me to be present. So I have to like move all the crazy so that you get past that and you get to me, which then can operate like a normal human being. Okay, so when you left corporate, did you have the podcast and everything going on the side already?
I had none of it going on the side.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I I had started my after I left corporate, to clarify, I had started my first business where I was doing search, but in a different way. I was one of the first companies that was offering fractional executives. And so I had formed close relationships with VC firms, but more importantly, private equity firms. And I had a group of individuals that I built up that would go in and fulfill different operating roles. And so I had already become an entrepreneur, but and I thought that initially that was going to be this calling to step away from corporate. But what I found myself in was engulfed in the same situations that I was in before, just different situations. So I think, like many people who have spent a long time in corporate, the companies don't encourage you to have personal brands. In fact, when I was with Lowe's, they absolutely de- were adamant that you shouldn't have one because let's face it, they want you talking.
Do you feel that's changing though in today's world? I feel like brands are doing a little bit better at empowering the platform to spread their message or not. You don't think that's anymore?
No, I do. I think it depends on the company and how progressive they are. What I, if anyone's listening, what I would tell them to do is to go out there and ignore whatever the company is telling you and to create this personal brand and start cultivating it because what it gives you is so many benefits. Imagine being a salesperson and you go to call on a client for the first time and they're trying to do research on you and they can't find anything versus you creating a brand where they can go and see what makes you tick. It to me it makes a world of difference. But in my case, I had a small presence. I was on LinkedIn. I really wasn't on some of the other major platforms. And so I originally started coming up with the concept for the book, and I went to some book agents who said candidly, John, how do you even know that what you're putting in the book is going to resonate with anyone? And more importantly, how do you even know it's going to sell because you have no audience? And so that was in the middle of COVID, and my first thought was I'll go speak, but I'm not sure about you, but when I do virtual speeches, you can't really see how the audience is responding very well. And so the only outlet that I really had was to attempt to start a podcast and a YouTube channel as a means to try to see if what I had in the book would actually resonate. And luckily it has.
Oh, it definitely has. Your podcast is super successful, and everything you leaned into has been doing great. So we know this book is going to be magic
It's been such a humbling experience for sure.
for sure. Okay, so when did you decide now I'm going to write Passion Struck? Like, when did that piece happen?
So I decided I wanted to write probably while I was doing that other company, and I started putting
Okay.
out blogs, but they were more blogs about entrepreneurship or business related topics. And I guess it was around 19 I guess it was around 2019, 2020 that I started to experiment with some blogs that were more focused on personal mastery and self-development. And I just kind of put them out there to see if anyone would respond to them. And I ended up writing one or two that got 10, 15,000 hits. And it told me that, man, I have this ability to write that's been a skill that I'm not utilizing. And so I actually started at that point to experiment on my own blog, on Medium, with some of the core topics that I wanted to talk about in the book. And then after starting the podcast, I experimented with a bunch of these. And it was great because things that I put out that weren't resonating with people, I either refined or I got rid of them. And then things that were resonating with people more became part of the book. And so it became really a journey over the past 3 years of writing it. But pretty much it came into being in uh, 2022. And then after I got the book deal, even further into 2023 as I was finalizing it.
And how do you think this book is different from like other self-help or personal development books that are currently on the marketplace?
Yeah, I love this question. So I read so many books,
Hmm.
and being a podcaster like you, we read a lot of books. I last year I read about 115 books, and the vast majority of them, I have to say, I read and then they go on a shelf and I don't bring them out again. But there's certain books, like I'll put one up right here that I just happen to have here because I was referring to it, like How
Oh,
Are the
yes,
Odds,
that's a great one.
the Miracle Morning, or Limitless by Jim Quick, or others that a lot of Robin Sharma books that I constantly refer back to. So I didn't want to write a book to be read. I wanted to write a book to be lived. And so what I think is different about my book is I give you these principles, and these principles didn't come out of thin air. I came up with them by studying 700 of the most passion struck people on the planet, people like Oprah Winfrey, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bono, Derek Jeter, etc. And then after coming up with them, I was able to mirror behavior science and positive psychology into each one of the principles. And then I actually got to implement them in my own life to understand that they actually worked. And so I lay out the principles, I give you exercises on how to create them. But in the third section of the book, it's called The Psychology of Progress, and it basically teaches you how to implement them and how to take deliberate action in your life. And so I really wanted it as something that people would come back to at different points in their life and utilize to keep their momentum going.
One of them, one of the 12 powerful principles is fear confronter. I've had to confront a lot of fear in climbing mountains and doing different things. Elaborate on that section of the book a little bit for the listeners today.
Yeah, so this So the way that I've outlined this is there are a series of principles that build up. So the first one is a mission angler, and that's about life crafting. The second one is a brand reinventor, because as you're crafting the life you want for your future self, you've got to shift who you are to be there. The third one is a mosquito auditor, which is auditing out the invisible influences in our life. And then to me, the next thing that you typically have to confront is your deepest self doubts.
Hmm.
And your biggest self doubt is caused by yourself because you are your biggest competitor. And so this chapter is all about actionable ways to overcome self doubt and fear. And I used the story of Kirstie Ennis as the main person in the chapter. And if people aren't familiar with her, I know you are. Um, she's a remarkable woman. She was on her last deployment, on her last day, on her last helicopter flight in Afghanistan, and it ends up crashing. And she ends up with these horrific injuries, losing limbs and everything else. And like I think any of us, she did confront what her life could look like. And she had these fears of what am I supposed to do with it now that I have all these physical ailments? But the big turning point for her was she made the conscious choice that she wasn't going to let them define her. And in fact, she took on the mentality that she could do anything, regardless of what her physical limitations might be. And so she, similar to you, is on this goal of climbing the 7 summits. She's doing the typical summits people do,
Yeah.
not the second summits like you did.
Yep.
But as far as I know, she's accomplished 6 and she's tried Everest a couple times and is going to go back and try to do it again. And I know you consult with her, and I just interviewed Harry Buddha Magar, who is the first individual who has lost both legs above their knees to climb Everest. And I know he's trying to give her inspiration as well.
Yeah, she's a great human. Great, great, great human doing amazing things with this world for sure. Okay, so bring us into, do you feel like everybody goes through this process like sequentially, or is there ever a time where you're going to bounce back to a previous principle to be able to continue forward?
No, one of the things I think it's important for people to understand is that passion struck isn't an end state. I think
Hmm.
it's this constant thing we're trying to do. It's trying to live that self-realized self. I don't think we just try to go for our ideal self and we're there one day and we don't stop. And I mean we stop and we don't continue growing. I think it's this constant evolution. So as with anything in life, I think there's a whole bunch of peaks and valleys, and there are times when you're going to really be able to push forward in your life, and then there are times that you might come back. And so I took that into consideration. And in the first chapter of the third section of the book, I came up with the 5 plateaus on the journey to becoming passion struck. And I did it because I was getting so many questions from different people, including my publisher, of how is someone supposed to know where they're at. And so I have a quiz that they can take on passionstruck.com. It's 20 minutes, or it's 20 questions long, takes you about 10 minutes, and it will show you on which level you're at, what that level means, and then what it's going to take to start the journey on the next one. And then in the book, I give examples of everyone from someone who went to jail and is basically coming out and starting from new and having to build their life from scratch to someone who had a very successful career, experienced cancer, decided she wanted to reposition her life, and how she was able to use that with the book too. But I really wrote it for different groups of people. The new person who's just entering the workforce as a way to cultivate their life, the person who's stuck so that they can learn how to become unstuck, and the high achiever who's maybe gotten to a certain level and they're trying to figure out how to level up. So it really, and the entry point is where you're at and embracing the principle that can move you to the next level.
No, I love that. And you do talk about like external validation versus intrinsic motivators. Like, how does somebody help identify what those intrinsic motivators are?
Well, I think this is an extremely important one because what I
Hmm.
found in my own life is that I was letting all the extrinsic things dictate my life. I was overly concerned with making money and getting promotions and the titles and the house I had and all those things. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but they shouldn't be the main driving force. So ultimately, to me, what drives intrinsic motivation is contentment, happiness, and relationships. And so it's really understanding what are those activities or goals that are going to bring you closer to those things. And something that I did that I think is a great metaphor for people to try themselves is when I was at this point, I went and I sought professional help with a career coach. And I remember talking to him about what I was feeling, etc. And he said, John, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to do a visualization exercise with me. And so I did. And he goes, I want you to imagine you're walking into your kitchen and there's a stool there. And I want you to imagine that it's a stool, but it has one thick support underneath it. And I want you to sit on it. He goes, now I want you to think that that support is the constant grind. What do you think that constant grind is going to do to you over time? It's going to cause you to become unstable, and eventually that stool is going to crash over and nothing's going to catch you. And he said, now I want you to think about the things that should be guiding your intrinsic motivation. And they could be whatever pillars you want to put underneath that stool. But if you start cultivating those in your life, you're going to have a far different outcome because you're always going to have something that can hold you up. And so for me, it became my relationship health, my emotional health, my physical health, my mental health, my spiritual health. And they kind of became the pillars for me that made me intrinsically motivated to do what I'm doing today. And I always thought if I can master those, then the career stuff is going to come easy because if you're balanced there, you're going to find balance in your career. But if you don't have that balance, you're always going to be out of balance in your career. So I think it's an important lesson for others to take away.
What are you noticing for yourself personally when you're like, oh, like, what are your triggers? Like, I'm getting out of balance, or I need to reevaluate or pivot.
So I think with anything, uh, it's putting the recognition or putting the progress that you're making in perspective. I think
Okay.
that we need to reward yourself. I'm not honestly the best at it. I've always been one of those.
What does it look like when you reward yourself? What do you do for yourself when it's a reward?
Well, historically, I was horrible at it. I remember I was interviewing Rachel Hollis, and we were laughing about this because she was just like me. It's like our reward is for 5 minutes long, and then we're on to the next thing. So I'm trying to be more mindful about how I examine these recognitions, and that I make sure that when I am rewarding myself, it's in alignment with the long-term aspiration that I want. So previously, I probably wouldn't have celebrated too much. Now I try to celebrate the triumphs, but I try to do it in an intentional way. I'll tell you one thing I really want to do is after this book comes out is reward myself with a vacation because it's about time. And if you don't give yourselves those mental breaks, you end up in that same state of burnout.
Definitely. Where are you going? Do you have a place picked out?
Right now, I want to go to the mountains, although it's going to be cold, but you never know. I could come to Salt Lake City. I love to
Yeah,
ski.
I'll take you skiing. You can come up to Park City anytime. We'll go hit the slopes for sure if you're interested. So I love it. Um,
Yeah, I'm so jealous that you have that right in your backyard because it's so nice. Because when you fly into Colorado, where I typically ski, you've got to drive so many hours to get to the good slopes, and for you, it's like 30, 40 minutes, and you're right there.
yeah, right. And I live in Park City, so I am 5 minutes from getting on a lift chair. It's fantastic. I drop kids off at school. We'll do a couple runs and then come back home to work. I'm not complaining.
No, that's awesome.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so you talk about like we briefly touched on the mosquitoes, right? There's three types of human mosquitoes in your life: the bloodsucker, the invisible suffocator, and the PITA, PITA. How do you identify them, acknowledge them, and let go of that toxicity?
Okay, so I think it's good for me to do a little bit of setup here because
Okay, perfect.
I came up with this because I love Jonah Berger's books, and he's got one on invisible influences. And so, as we're on this as we're on this progression, this transformational journey, one of the things that gets in the way the most is those things that influence us, whether it's people or the activities that we're doing that are keeping us from becoming who we want to become. And so it was important for me to give people an easy way to think about this with a metaphor that they could use. And so I happened to be on one of those mindful walks. I was thinking about this topic, and after I get done thinking about it, and this whole invisible influence thing really came to top of mind, and then I just happened to listen to a. I think sometimes the universe puts these things into place on purpose, but I happened to listen to this radio show, and they were talking about what's the most dangerous animal on the planet, and like everyone else who was listening, I was guessing that it was a great white shark or a dangerous jellyfish or one of those things. And it turns out it's none of those things. It's the pesky mosquito, and it kills over a million, close to 2 million people per year. And it just got me thinking that similar to real mosquitoes, the human mosquitoes in our lives are very similar. There are these invisible influences that are often there right in our very presence. They've sometimes been there for a very long time, especially if they're a family influence. And they're oftentimes the ones who are giving us these external voices that are causing us to have fears, self doubt, everything else that we can't accomplish where we want to go. So I wanted to come up with three that people could really understand. Obviously, there's more than just three, but I thought these three were a great starting point to help people understand. So I came up with the bloodsucker, which are those people who just want to be manipulative. They want to get every ounce of blood that they can from you in service of helping themselves, but doing nothing to help you. And they're really boundary destroyers. Then there's the invisible suffocator, which are those people in our lives who are the half glass empty types, the pessimist, who are constantly in our ear telling us why we shouldn't take that opportunity, why we shouldn't pursue that dream, why we shouldn't date this person, all those things. And then lastly, there's the piece of works in our life, which are the pain in the asses or the PETAs, who could. One of my favorite examples is you're a realtor and you've got 10 different clients you're working for, but this PETA thinks that they're the most important out of all of them, and you should dedicate 90% of your time to them and not give any time to anyone else. I mean, that's just an example, but these PETAs are probably the ones that are most common. But the important thing is now, once you understand what these are, it's you need to do something about it. So I recommend as a good starting point that you look at whether it's an archery target or a target with a gun, and you start labeling people in the concentric circles from the bullseye. Maybe just do the first 2 to 3 concentric circles, put 5 people in each that have the greatest influence over your life, and see if any of these are these types of mosquitoes. And the likelihood is pretty high that you're going to find some there. So then once you do discover them, it then becomes a choice of what are you going to do about it. Mm-hmm. I'm not coming here saying that you should just swat them out of your life, although you might need to do that. But it typically means that you're going to have to start enforcing boundaries and magnifying the boundaries that you have and being consistent about it to let them understand what you will allow them to influence and what you're not going to allow them to influence going forward.
Those boundaries, right? Those boundaries that protect us and keep us on our path and don't let mosquitoes bite us and take us down. It's good. It's good. Okay, when somebody needs to take like that bold next step, what do you say to encourage them to do that?
So I kind of go back to that quote that I started from mm-hmm. with Henry David Thoreau, and that at the end of your day, do you want to look back and realize that you were living in quiet desperation for so much of your life? And the crazy thing is if you look at the science, it shows that the vast majority of us are doing just that. There was a 2018 research report that came out of Cornell University that basically found that in examining thousands of people who were nearing their deathbeds, that 76% of them all had the same regret. And that regret was that they didn't live the ideal life that they felt they should have. And I, I think it's trying to paint a vivid picture for them of what that looks like. Because when you're not living that life that you aspire to live, you end up feeling the same way I was. And you start feeling apathetic. You feel like you lack meaning in your life. And it ends up putting you into a position where you just don't feel meaning or happiness or contentment. And is that really how you want to live your life? So I guess I try to get them to think about what's the worst thing that's going to happen if you start taking this other path, is you're going to end up where you are right now anyhow. So, but I encourage them to try to do it by taking small steps. For instance, instead of doing like I initially tried to do and try to start changing multiple areas of my life, pick one area. Maybe if you go back to my pillars and say you want to work on your emotional health, start start taking some actions specifically in that area that are going to help you to start building that new area in your life out. And I promise you, what's going to happen is the more you start making these small micro choices, they not only form habits in that one area, but you end up seeing them articulate to different parts of your life. And before you know it, it's kind of like burnout. It's not as if we are at burnout like flipping a switch. Burnout typically happens because you start experiencing it long before you really recognizing it's happening to you. And I think the same thing with our personal growth is these small steps. Before you know it, you wake up and they start accumulating and your life is becoming very different. And for me, it really took me getting rid of the safety parachute that I had and really taking that leap of faith to do something different. Some people might not be capable of taking something as risky as that, but you can definitely start pointing yourself, however way you want to do it, into a new direction. I personally think what works best most of the time is not giving yourself that fallback because it's so easy to take it. But for some people, that might be impossible to do. So just start taking the steps that are intentionally getting you closer to where you want to be.
I agree. Burn the boats. Just burn the boats and go. And then you're going to have to figure it out. Like sink or swim. That's how it works for me, or that's how it's worked for me. I love people that are a little less aggressive and have that flow a little bit better than I do in life. Um, John, we can get the book all at every bookstore online, everything else. You have your website. How do people reach out to you, work with you, all those other good things?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen, for asking.
Yeah.
So, if you want to find me on all the social channels, it's now pretty easy. You just go to John R, my middle name, Miles. And I had to do that, and anyone who does personal branding might have to too, because I have a famous relative who was a rock star in England, and it's impossible for me to get ranked against him. So I also have a website, johnrmiles.com. If you want to listen to the Passion Struck podcast or know more about Passion Struck or pre order the book, the best place to go is passionstruck.com. And if they do pre order before it launches, I have over $300 of free gifts that I've custom curated for the audience.
Amazing. I love it. This book, I got a sneak peek because I was doing the podcast interview. It's definitely one of those reference books that you're going to be able to come back to and get ideas from and say, oh, here's where I am. Here's what I can do. Here's how I can proceed. So, John, I'm grateful that you changed into this big shift and have turned your success into something significant. So, thanks for joining us today.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for having me on the show and for also being such a huge advocate on the need to create significance in your life, because to me, it's one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now in the world is unmattering.